Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Somehow We Manage. We have another special guest today, Mrs. Dana O'Neill. You may know her from her illustrious career as a writer. She is a senior writer with The Athletic, and she's also recently released a book about the Big East, the most influential and entertaining conference in college basketball history. So she has a lot of knowledge to share with us today, and you're not going to want to go anywhere, so stick around. Dana O'Neill joining us now on Somehow We Manage. It's a pleasure to be talking to her today. Miss O'Neill, how are you?
I am terrific. Thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, yes, for sure. For sure. We're so happy to have you on. We're here in the summertime, not a whole lot going on in the world of sports, but we did just wrap up the NBA finals. So give me your take. What do you think about this recent NBA finals that we just concluded here?
Yeah, I mean, so I had to be honest, back in a million years ago, I covered Kyle Lowry when he was at Villanova. So I was a little bit more leaning for the Heat, I think I would say, just to see if Kyle could get himself one more championship. But I thought it was a great series. I mean, Denver is just like, I think they're just a terrific team. It's not a surprise that they won that beat the Heat the way they did and were so dominant. I just love watching, it's kind of fun for me as a college basketball writer to watch. I remember doing a story on Aaron Gordon when he was a freshman. Last year, Christian Brown was at Kansas. Like, these guys, it all resonates with me. So it's kind of, I don't know. So I watch it completely, maybe differently than other people, because I sit there and flash back a little bit. But it was a great final. I was excited to see some different teams involved. I know maybe TV ratings might have wanted a little Celtics Lakers action perhaps, but I happen to like some new blood getting in there myself.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, as a sports fan, NBA fan, whatever, I think we all want to see parity, right? I mean, we get tired of seeing I think everybody got tired of seeing the Cavs and the Warriors there every year, right? And seeing a guy like Jimmy Butler and Jokic, all very likable guys, right?
Yes.
But yeah,
yes, and exactly, and guys that are superstars in their own right, but they weren't always, right? I mean,
yeah.
You look at guys like Jimmy Butler, that just kind of earned everything that they've gotten. I mean, that entire Heat roster, if you look at them, is kind of crazy. Lack of first round, picks and all that stuff. So yeah, I thought it was really good for the NBA at some level, maybe, to have some new blood and some new faces and some new energy to market the game better for them. So yeah, I thought it was great. It was great. Now it's like, all right, now what do we got to watch? Back to baseball, I guess, right?
And I think, Jokic certainly got a lot of respect after this series. But here's my thing. When are we going to give the Heat organization the respect that they deserve? I mean, look, even since 06 whenever it was when they won that championship with D Wade and Shaq. Since then, I mean, they've been in the finals. How many times? They lured LeBron in. They were able to build it back up with Jimmy Butler. They're here again. They went in the bubble. I mean, when Eric Spoelstra, all these guys. I mean, he started as a video guy with the Heat. I mean, when are we give this organization the respect that they deserve?
Yeah, it's funny because you're right, because they're still portrayed sort of as this little engine that could. I mean, granted, I know their seed this year kind of played into that, but there's just, because there's there was obviously with LeBron, but there's not that name brand obvious person. There just seems to be, and it's a different market. I mean, it's not New York, it's not LA, it's not like the traditional market that's been around forever that people just don't understand. Like, to do what they've done consistently is really hard. It's really hard in any sport, but in a sport like that where everybody is so transient, it's really difficult. And I think you're right. Like, Spoelstra is just a terrific coach to manage the games in the way he did this season. I think they're overdue, but it's kind of part of their sort of their who they are at this point. I think they almost like it at some level, right? I mean,
oh yeah,
people
for sure.
discount, right? Like that whole underdog, like people don't take a serious chip on ourselves. I think that's almost part of their identity at this point, and they're just going to roll with it. So they might as well just keep. It's worked pretty well.
It has. So the Big East, there's this book that we've heard so much about. You titled it "The Big East: The Most Entertaining and Influential Conference in the History of College Basketball." So I'm zooming in from North Carolina today. I'm here in the heart of ACC country, right? So those are fighting words to the people that I grew up around the sport. All the fans that I've been around my whole life. So I want to ask you, make your case. Why is that so? Why is the Big East the most entertaining and influential conference in college basketball history?
So in my opinion, it's a couple of things. And number one of it, look, I mean, this sounds like East Coast biased, but like, let's be honest, like there is an East Coast bias in the world, right? And so when the East Coast, New York, that kind of world gets involved in something, it just sort of explodes the exposure of it. So the fact that the Big East kind of captured the heart of New York and that whole sort of, Northeast corridor, I think helped. But the reason I think that they were so influential was timing. They started when ESPN was starting, and the marriage of that conference with the players that they had, Patrick Ewing and Pearl Washington, and you could go on and on and on. Chris Mullin, it made college basketball like something to watch. It became must-watch TV on Big Monday when they had them on ESPN, because the games were so good and such high quality and insane, because the coaches were bananas, right? I mean, all these personalities. It made college basketball sort of it had always been big regionally. This helped the game grow nationally. And the interesting thing is, to give the devil in the ACC its due, the reason that the Big East started in part was they were tired. East Coast coaches were tired of all the great New York players going down to Carolina, going down to the ACC, right? Like, why can't we keep these people home? We need to start something that is our own. But I think the difference that the Big East did, and then, the ACC was certainly involved in this to an extent, but before that, there were like these big marquee games every once in a while, but the entire season wasn't marketable and watchable until the Big East sort of made people want to, like, people in California were watching Big Monday basketball games because of Patrick Ewing and guys like that. That wasn't happening in college basketball prior to the start of the Big East.
What kind of relationships have you had with the coaches and players in the Big East throughout the years?
I mean, terrific. I started 100 years ago in the area, and I worked at the Philadelphia Daily News for years, back when the Big East was kind of that gigantic mess of everybody in the league. But, from that, I got to know Jim Calhoun and John Thompson, obviously Jim Boeheim, Louis Carnesecca, and their personalities. That was the other thing I think you can't underscore, was their ability to be true to themselves, for better or worse, made everything so much more entertaining as well. But they were also, think about that list of coaches I just read to you, or said to you, those are all Hall of Famers. I mean, the league got super lucky also that when they decided to start the league, they had this great stable of amazing coaches. And then at the same time, Patrick Ewing and Chris Mullin are coming out of high school. I mean, you talk about incredibly wonderful timing. So yeah, I love those coaches because they're great storytellers. Like, you call somebody and say, hey, I'm going to write a book about the Big East. It's not like, oh, I don't have anything to say. It's like, I got to cut you off. Like, I can't talk all day. There were just such great stories to be told all day long. And I didn't even mention like PJ Carlesimo, people like that were just, Gary Williams. Some great coaches came through that league.
Yeah, and I know that the rivalries were very strong in the Big East. You talk about like the sweater game, stuff like that. What's your craziest story from a coach or just an experience you had while you were in the Big East?
So the craziest story I heard when they were telling me about for the book. So there was a game between Syracuse and Georgetown, and there was a call at the end that was controversial. And Jim Boeheim got so inflamed and so angry when Mike Tranghese, who was then the assistant commissioner, went in to see Jim to kind of calm him down. He was like, so all over the mouth, literally gesticulating and just going crazy. And he ended up headbutting Tranghese, and to the point where Mike Tranghese is like bleeding. So, Dave Gavitt calls and says, hey, is everything okay? I know there was a controversial call. He's like, yeah, your coach just headbutted me. And he's like, what? Like, what's like, it was that insane. Like, they were just, people chasing each other down back hallways, like trying, like angry at like Rolly Massimino. I covered Rolly when he was at Villanova. I mean, he was outrageously entertaining. I can't even tell you. And John Thompson too. I remember the best thing about John Thompson. So when you covered Georgetown, when John Thompson was the head coach, this was great because the first reporter, he would come into the media room. And as soon as he walked into the media room, the locker room was opened. As soon as he stopped speaking, the locker room was closed. So you couldn't be in both places at the same time, which was intentional because he didn't care if you couldn't be in both. In fact, he liked it if you couldn't be in both places at the same time. So that was always fun. It was just like, that was just John being John.
Oh yeah. Well, Coach Thompson, a legend.
Yeah,
So,
great.
You've covered some of the biggest moments in sports, and I know you've stated in the past, some of your favorites. You talk about the Kentucky Derby, you talk about the NCAA tournaments, all those things. When you look back on those moments, what do you think makes them so special?
Yeah, I think, time and place, right? Big shots obviously are, I'm ancient, so I was at the Christian Laettner buzzer beater, right? Like the improbability of how that happened at that moment makes that have such staying power. Fast forward to Chris Jenkins' buzzer beater against Caroline, it's the same thing. It's the improbability of that shot and the emotion after it. But, I happen to think like most of it is pure ecstasy and pain, if you will. Like that's kind of what we all get into sports about at some level, like those who are fans, those who cover it, those who play it. It's that you don't know what's going to happen. Like there's no predictable outcome. Like you can guess like team X should beat team Y, but you don't know. And when the moments happen and they coalesce in this sort of like impossible finish, that's what stays. That's what makes sports great. It's like that just happened and I got to watch that. Like, there are just still times where I get up and I'm like, what in the world? Like I shouldn't be allowed to be paid for this. This is fantastic. So, and I think when they transcend like fan interest, it's one thing. Even people who weren't Duke or Kentucky fans were transfixed by Christian Laettner's shot. They just were. It's just, you don't even have to be a basketball fan, right? It's just this improbable moment. And to me, even college sports, maybe more than anything else, because there is that alma mater, love for your school, and the rivalries are a little different, a little deeper sometimes than they are in the NFL or in the NBA. They're not paid. I think all of that kind of rattles in there too.
All right. So, we've been talking a lot about the Big East, right? And I've talked about, being here in the ACC or in ACC country, I guess. And obviously, a couple years back was when, the big realignment happened and, a lot of the bigger schools left to essentially join the ACC. What was your reaction when you found out that was going to happen?
I mean, it was such a mess. I remember, look, some of them, like you didn't cry over as much as it, like Boston College was like, oh, that stinks, but whatever. Nothing personal. When Syracuse and Pitt left, that was a body blow, especially Syracuse. Just because so much of the fabric of the Big East Conference was built on these rivalries that had lasted, and the geography and the tensions that all created, and Pitt too. Like even though Pitt wasn't quite right in the mix, like they had established sort of a Big East, image that they were this tough kind of blue collar rough team. I think from if you're a professional and you're whatever, sane about it, you understood from a financial standpoint why it was happening, but you also couldn't understand why it had to happen at the same time. Like, why are we all messing with this great thing? And it was hard to watch. It was really hard to watch. And I remember, I'll be honest, I remember when the what was then called the Catholic Seven, when the old Big East schools decided to get together and kind of take the ball and go play by themselves. I remember thinking, I love this idea. I do not think this is going to work. I was concerned that without the money of football and with football steering so many of the decisions, that it was going to get rolled over. And history has proven that I was dead wrong. So, that's the great outcome, I think, of the realignment, is the Big East kind of rebirthed itself in its own image and survived and proved that you can survive. But it was rough to watch. And I think if you put a truth serum into people at Syracuse, and maybe less so Pitt, but certainly Syracuse, I'm not sure they're happy that they made that decision. It hasn't worked well for Syracuse in any capacity. It really hasn't.
Yeah, and so you talk about the league surviving. Most people thinking it wouldn't. How do you think the league handled the situation after the fact?
I think what made it work was what always made the Big East work was a sense of collegiality that was formed among these schools. Like they were aligned with one another really strongly, and they recognized, like, unlike a lot of schools I think that have gone through realignment who don't really necessarily know who they are, the Big East schools knew who they were. Like, we're basketball schools. We're not complicated. We're not trying to chase football. UConn did for a little while, and it was a disaster. And I think what made it work for those schools was a great concept of what their identity was and what worked for their identity, and a recognition that together they were stronger than separately. I think a lot of problems in realignment, frankly, is a lot of people are looking out for themselves, and they align themselves with the schools and teams that they think will get them money, but they don't necessarily align themselves with schools that are like them. It doesn't. West Virginia makes no sense in the Big 12. No one's ever going to convince me that that was a good idea. Like, from Mount Morgantown to Lubbock is not a viable commute. UCLA and USC, I get it, but good luck. I mean, really, you're going to come, your soccer team's coming to Piscataway every year? Like, but whereas the Big East is like, you know what, never mind. You guys go do that messy stuff. We're going to go find schools that think like us and make this work. And it works. It works really well. I mean, they've had 3 national champions. I mean, Creighton has been knocking on the door. Providence was really good. Now that Rick Pitino's back in, St. John's is going to be good. They've had no shortage of success.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it seems like every year we're reminded of that, because the Big East, I feel like now is, I guess, an afterthought in a lot of people's minds, but every year here we are, consistently ranked in the top 25. You have to think that Rick Pitino is going to turn things around at St. John's. I mean, yeah. Villanova, what in a span of 3 years, won 2 national championships not too long ago. I mean, the league is, as far as basketball goes, the league is doing just fine.
Absolutely. And you look, I said, Creighton's really good. Shaka Smart has Marquette back on the map, and figuring out, like I said, Ed Cooley got Providence going. I guarantee you he will get Georgetown going again. I've always argued that the one thing that the Big East, like in its reformation, needed was Georgetown and St. John's to be relevant again, because the branding relationship of those schools and the markets that they present is so important and critical to the league's success. And now they have coaches, I think, that will actually make that happen. So yeah, I mean, they are an afterthought. They're always going to be, because they don't have football. But when the attention turns to college basketball, again and again and again, they stand up and say, here we are, and we're really good at this. And really good at this. And I think if you ask most college basketball coaches across the country, no matter what league they're aligned with, they would tell you that the Big East is legit and formidable. I mean, they've had, obviously DePaul has had its struggles. There are some teams that have not necessarily made it, but most have been elevated by the league kind of reconstituting itself.
You mentioned USC, you mentioned West Virginia, schools that have moved out of their old conferences. How do you view this larger topic of conference realignment? Because, like you said, fans are worried. People are worried about, it not making a whole lot of sense. I mean, like you said, the Big East had these strong ties to the North, right? So how do you view this, the larger issue of conference realignment?
I mean, the problem is that the people making the decisions are just chasing money 100%. And nothing practical, right? So, and I'm not sure, like, so far it hasn't backfired, right? Like, it hasn't gotten to the point where people have had a revolution and are like, no, a revolt. I'm not paying attention anymore. People are still going to the games, they're still watching games. And let's face it, they get a 12-team football playoff. People are going to watch. I don't care. That's just reality. But I'm not sure that it's a better product. I mean, I think it's important that they work to restore like some sort of semblance of rivalries and stuff. Like, I know Kansas and Missouri are trying to play each other, things like that. Like, I don't know, like for the general fan, like I said, people still go and they still love it. I'm a Penn State graduate. So, okay. Does Penn State, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, that's cool. Yeah, that's pretty cool, I guess. But is it a rivalry? I'm not sure. It's not Penn State Pitt. I can tell you that. It's not what it used to be. So, like I said, it hasn't backfired on them. I'll be really curious to see how the Texas-Oklahoma shift and the USC-UCLA shift work. Because again, like, they made it for football, but at some point your tennis team has to go somewhere too. How does that work? And what happens to the Olympic sports? Like, what happens to those programs and how they survive all of this? And do fans get sick of it? I don't know. My guess is probably not, because as long as we have an NCAA tournament and a 12-team football playoff, the end game's always going to be good enough to endure the regular season, I guess.
100%. And what happens when we inevitably have this 50-team mega conference and you've got Georgia Tech playing Minnesota on, in the 12 o'clock slot on a Saturday? Who's going to watch that? And why should the fans care at that point?
Well, that's what I say. And look, I mean, there have been some evidence of that, like in college basketball. UConn leaving the Big East and joining the American, like nobody cared about UConn Tulsa basketball at all. It practically killed UConn men's and women's basketball. It really did. So that is a legitimate question. Like I guess, like, if you're Rutgers and USC and UCLA are coming in, that's a pretty cool deal, right? I get that, but if you're UCLA and USC, is Rutgers coming in as good? It doesn't cut both ways. Like UCLA and USC coming to Rutgers is a big deal for Rutgers. Rutgers going to Los Angeles, do people care? Probably not. So that's going to be interesting. And my one thing is, like, as long as they don't touch the NCAA tournament, like, then we're good. Like if they start messing with the NCAA tournament, then I'm going to like start going after people, because don't mess that good thing, please.
I'm glad you mentioned, Olympic non-revenue sports, because they always seem to get left out of these conversations. NIL, all that good stuff, right? Yep. What happens when, like you said, the tennis team at UCLA, their travel expenses, and I can't even imagine what the football team is going to spend, or USC or whoever. But like, what's going to happen to the athletic department? I mean, they're going to take such a huge hit. But I mean, like you said, money talks. At the end of the day, football is going to make so much money. Is it really going to matter?
Well, I mean, yeah, and yes and no. Like I think two things. One, football is going to make a ton of money, but then football has to carry the load for everybody else. And that's a pretty darn heavy load to carry, right? So you can't afford to stink, right? If you're UCLA and you have a couple down years, it's going to be rough. Like your ticket sales go down, you're carrying the entire athletic department. So that's a big ask. Things I've heard about what they're going to do is like, and I don't know if this is true. I don't know if this is settled yet, but it's a thing that's been pitched around. Like, so I don't even know what sports they sponsor, but let's just pretend UCLA sponsors men's soccer, women's soccer, and field hockey, for argument's sake. Those three teams, I've been told, will get on a charter. They will fly east. They will play Rutgers, Penn State, Maryland, whatever, Ohio State, whatever schools they can get in sort of like almost like a barnstorming event, take courses online, and then go back home. So that they could minimize the travel rather than sending the soccer team across and the field hockey team across. But I don't know how that works on the reverse side, because what are you going to do? You're going to put the Rutgers and Penn State and Ohio State and Maryland teams on a charter together and then send them to California? I don't know. The expense is going to be astronomical. And, as you said, the Olympic sports usually aren't considered, and charters aren't usually even in the budget. They're usually on commercial airlines. Well, now you're asking these people to fly 5 hours across the country and deal with, I don't know if you've flown lately, but it's not fun out there. No. So I don't know. I mean, they don't care is the short answer. And I'd be curious to see if at some point, if they don't find a way to regionalize, like, I don't know, is it worth it for the soccer team at UCLA to play in the Big Ten? Wouldn't it make more sense, especially if the Pac-12 crumbles or the Mountain West crumbles or whatever, to kind of align a field hockey league out there? I don't know. But again, like, I don't know that anyone really has thought about that too hard.
No, that's actually a great point, though. So you mentioned Penn State, right? You're a Penn State grad. Could you tell us just a little bit about how you got your start in sports journalism?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of a silly story, because it's kind of funny, because I had no idea what I was going to do when I went to Penn State. I was, I was an athlete in high school. I was always around sports. I like sports. I was a fan. I like to write, but never put those two things together. I went to Penn State actually thinking I was going to major in business because I had a rich uncle and I thought I could be rich too. And I took one economics course and I was like, well, that's not happening. So what do I do? And by dumb luck, my freshman year RA was on the Daily Collegian. And so we were mostly a freshman dorm. And so she would have like little meetings with us at the beginning of the school year and start talking about activities to get involved in. And she mentioned the Daily Collegian, and Penn State's a big school. I went to a super tiny high school. So I was trying to find my way and, get involved in something. And I don't know what motivated me, because I'd never worked on the high school paper, but I was like, maybe that'd be fun. So they sent you in to take a test and they gave you like 10 facts and you had to kind of construct a story. And again, I had zero experience. I'd never worked for a college paper. I'd called in like scores for our baseball team and our football. I kept football stats, but I never wrote. So at the end, they asked you, if you get chosen for the Collegian, what section would you like to work for? And I like processing through my head. I remember this so clearly thinking, well, news is kind of serious. That doesn't sound like fun. I like sports. I'll write sports. Maybe I'll meet Joe Paterno. That would be cool. That was my entire thought process. And I got selected for the paper. I covered field hockey. I played field hockey that fall, and I came home I'll never forget, I came home at Thanksgiving. I told my parents I want to be a sports writer. That was it. Like, I have no idea if Jen Edwards wasn't my RA my freshman year, what would happen to me? I have no idea if I would have figured this out on my own. I like to think so, but I don't know.
So you say your motivation was just to get to meet Joe Paterno, right? Such a legendary figure in college football, right? What exactly did he mean to that community and to that fan base?
Hard to put into words because, Penn State is a land grant institution in the middle of Pennsylvania. Like, the nearest town is not a town. You know what I mean? There's not much there. It's a great institution academically, all those things, now, but in terms of exposure, athletic departments always like to say your sports can be your front porch, and they'll get people to pay attention. And so, the fact that Penn State football got to be really good and got to be aligned with what people perceived as Joe's personality or integrity or whatever you want to call it, it gave Penn State this reputation as an institution beyond a football program, which is probably kind of silly if you think about it in retrospect, but that's what happened. And it was like, but he was also very, he was a great big deal, but he also walked to every football game. So he wasn't like hiding in some ivory tower. He was very accessible. And that made it seem a little bit more real and a little bit less, I don't know, something more that you could be proud of. Our coach is really good at winning football, but he's not in some ivory tower ignoring us. Like, I can remember working my freshman year for a local paper back home. We had a player from our local town that was his quarterback, or he was his backup quarterback at the time. And it was an off season. I was like, I'm going to try to do a story on Tom. I put in a call to request to speak to Joe, and I'm thinking, this is never going to happen. And lo and behold, my phone rings in my dorm my freshman year, and it's like, "Hi, Dana, this is Coach Paterno." I'm like, what? Like, 18 years old, I was beside myself. So he did stuff like that, and that all got intertwined with Penn State's reputation. Of course, when everything went south, it all got messy.
And I always knew, obviously I'm younger. I always knew, he won so many games. He was this great coach. But one of our assistant coaches at UNCW, Kurt Kanaski, he coached at Penn State, and so he got to know Coach Paterno very well. They would travel around with the caravan and stuff like that. And he just talked about what a dynamic speaker he was, and just this great personality, right? And he said that whenever he would speak to the Booster Club, he would always end it the exact same way. He would say, "We need every cent you can have. We need every dollar you can give." He said, "But we don't need your 2 cents." He said, "You can leave that at home." He said the people would just go nuts. He said he just had them in the palm of his hand. And I never understood that about Paterno. But if you go back and look, he really kind of, maybe comparable to like Dean Smith, he just had a stranglehold on that fan base.
Yes, he did. And it was winning, but it was more than just winning. It was how he represented. It's like, all the goofy things that everyone kind of made fun of. They didn't have the names on the back of their jerseys. That was all sort of part of the reputation and the image that he crafted at Penn State, that it wasn't about who you were, it's like who you played for and all of that. There was such, and Dean was the same way. Dean was all about, salute the guy that gave you the pass, right? That's a Dean Smith thing that players do all across the country because of Dean Smith. And there was something to be valued about that. And you're right. Like, Joe just, he was kind of gruff and grumbly and funny, but charming. And I remember they used to have a thing. They used to have a thing before home football games where they would invite the media to the Nittany Lion in for a reception. So it was mostly for visiting media, but anybody could go. And I went once, and it was like an open bar or something. And like, he was standing there, he was like, "Let me buy you a drink." And it was, it was a free drink. He was just being a funny man. And he handed me a drink and just started chatting at me. Like, and it was all off the record. It was nothing like being recorded, but he would show up to that thing and just be friendly and charming and personable. And so there was a lot to be built around that. And I think the comparison to Dean is very, very valid.
So how do you feel about how things ended up for Joe Paterno there late in his life with everything that went down?
Yeah, conflicted. It was really rough. I remember telling friends of mine, like, I went from literally in 12 hours where you would say, "Hey, where'd you go to school?" Penn State. "Oh man, that's awesome. Joe Paterno. Wow, that's so cool." 12 hours later, "Where'd you go to school?" "Penn State." "Oh." And it was like, we were all sort of guilty of something that most of us had nothing to do with. And I can remember when friends of mine who were covering the story, were all at Joe's house, like standing on his front lawn, kind of waiting for Joe to appear and all this. And I said, is anybody at Jerry Sandusky's front yard? Because at last I checked, he was the guy that's being accused of the crimes, like right now. But, Joe was more of a big deal, more salacious. And, I don't purport to know what Joe knew or didn't know. I tend to think that most of us like to think we know a person, but you really never know what happens when they close the door behind you. And no matter how close they are to you, it was a mess. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. And my nephew was going to be a freshman the next year. And I remember saying, I have no idea what to tell you. Like, I have no idea what to expect for you. I know what my experience at Penn State was. I don't know what yours is going to be. I remember being really proud of the football team, the seniors who stood up and stayed and did not transfer. I mean, there were literally assistant coaches on campus trying to take Penn State football players to get them to transfer. It was chaos. And these seniors all elected to stay and represent the university. And I was really moved by that. So, it stinks, I guess is the best way to say it, like that all happened. It's awful, like how in 1 second a man's entire life's work was erased, more or less. So, and it's still messy. People are still conflicted about it.
And I think, what happened aside, like you said, we don't know what he knew, but I think it just shows, the stress that and just the pedestal that these coaches are put on, especially, in a place like Penn State where he was just such a godlike figure. But the man literally, he died of a heart attack, did he not?
He had cancer.
Whatever it was. But come on, the man literally essentially died because of this situation,
A broken heart. Yeah, he died of a broken heart. Yeah. I think that's fair. Yeah.
And people, I don't know. I like I said, your son's been in it, and he'd probably tell you the same thing. Once you get in the inside of an athletic department, you just don't understand like how competitive it is and what these people go through. What the coaches go through. They never see their families, just that sort of thing. It really is just a tough industry to be in.
It's really tough, and to sustain it, period, whether you're winning or losing, is remarkable, right? And to stay at one place is remarkable. And then to do all that and win is unbelievable. So, I have a hard time personally just thinking that a man who stood out in front and had all this integrity and truly, practiced what he preached in terms of how he treated his athletes, like guys got suspended and all of these things that they didn't show up in shirts and ties for games, like crazy stuff. I have a hard time believing that he looked the other way and just said, I only care about winning a football game, ergo I'm not going to worry. I can't resonate that. But then again, I also think, there is also something to be said for, are we supposed to, lionize these football coaches? I don't know. They're at the end of the day, they're coaching a football game. They're not curing cancer, right? Like, people do a lot more important things on college campuses and win football games that don't get nearly the notoriety as a football coach or the basketball coach, whichever campus you're on. So there's something to be said for like keeping things in perspective as well. But we don't, that's just not how we operate as a country. We don't. So.
Right. Well, I'll try to close things on a happier note here. So as we have discussed, I'm a manager and your son is a manager at Michigan State under the legendary coach Tom Izzo. So could you tell me a little bit about his experience and what he's seen so far as a college basketball manager?
Yeah, he is a happy boy. My husband is an athletic trainer at Princeton, and because of what I do, Kieran has been around teams in some capacity his whole life, and he's an athlete himself. So when he started to think about going to college and things he wanted to do, I talked to him about being a manager, and I told him, I said, it is the hardest job on campus. I don't care in the athletic department. They work harder. Maybe other than the assistant coaches running around or a dobo, I don't know anybody that works harder than a manager, because they just, and you have to go to school. I said, but if you want to do it, like, go for it. But I was also very particular. Like, there are certain coaches that I trust that you will have a good experience, and certain ones that maybe I'm not sure what the experience will be. So I kind of greased the skids a little with him with Coach Izzo, because I've known Coach for years. And but I said, this, I'll get you to the doorstep. You got to get yourself over it, and then you've got to do the job. And God, he loves it. He is. I can't get him to come home, for heaven's sakes. Like, he came home from school, he went back out to work camp. He's coming home. He's going back out to work with the team. He's already told me next summer I'm staying. I want to stay and work with the team. I think it's like anything else. If the guy at the top is good, everything flows down. The Michigan State players treat their managers with great respect. Caegan goes and rebounds for AJ Hogarth in the morning or whatever, afterward, AJ will say, hey, I'll drive you back to your dorm. You want to stop and get lunch? He'll pay for the lunch, just small little things that say that you're appreciated. They have like a little room for the manager where all their names are on a plaque. They made it to the manager game Final Four, and they were fundraising to get the money to go, and they were going to not be able to afford to take everybody because they only fundraise so much. And Coach Izzo just floated them the rest. Just said, go. No manager left behind. Like, you're all going. So yeah, he's had an amazing experience. And, the team's really good. They're going to be excellent next year. So that makes it even more fun. But he got to go to the Big Ten tournament, went to the NCAA tournament. Heartbroken when they lost to Kansas State in the Sweet 16, but had a great run. So yeah, I had to trade off. I can't cover Michigan State anymore because it's a conflict of interest. I didn't want my son to be in a position where he couldn't feel like he could tell me things. So I didn't want to make that mess. And I didn't want to be in a position where I was like, I don't know, felt like I was being too laudatory because I love how they treat my son. So I was like, I'll just back off. Told my editors I'm out, which is fine. So, it's been awesome. I mean, and the contacts he's made, I'm sure, like with alums and people all that, right? Endless. And, yeah, he's having a ball. Like he was working his butt off, but he loves it. He's always been a kid that loves to work, but he's like going to practice every day. Like, it's not like he's like, digging a ditch. He's having a great time. So yeah. Well, academically. So I'm happy.
Well, and one thing I always stress to a new manager, I said, if you buy into this, I said, being a manager will change your life. And I'm sure your son has learned that already. And so, my advice would be to him, just stick with it. I mean, because
he's not leaving, trust me.
Yeah. I mean, it will literally change your life. And I'm starting to learn now, as I'm, I've just graduated, so I'm looking for jobs and things like that. People want to hire managers.
Correct.
And
you work hard.
Yeah. And I just think the skills you learn there, you just don't get anywhere else at that point in your life in college, just with a regular, part-time job working at Wendy's or whatever, but exactly. I think the skills 100% will change your life, and you'll carry them with you. So yeah, but it's really nice to hear someone giving managers a pat on the back, because we didn't always get that. You had to work hard.
It's funny. I've always had a soft spot for them. I don't know why. Like, I remember right when the manager games were starting, like when Kevin Palga was starting them, I wrote a whole story about the manager games. Like I went like at 11 o'clock at night to, I think Ohio State was playing somebody. Yeah, I think, I can't even remember, like Ohio. Oh no, it was Ohio State and somebody, because Ohio State rolled out with Greg Oden. I'm like, I don't think so. He's not a freaking manager. He's a grad student, yes, but you can't bring Greg Oden to a manager game. That's not fair. But yeah, so I always had a soft spot just because I knew how hard they worked. And so, yeah, I was so excited that he had the opportunity to do this. And like, no, he's already like, now maybe I can be a grad assistant. I'll go get my master's. He's got it all planned out. He might just never leave Michigan State at this point if he can keep it up. I mean, and like I said, Izzo's just great. Like, he's driven him home a couple times to, if Kieran was walking back, I'll give you a ride, Kieran, let's go. Or he had them all over for pizza, and it's awesome. Look, I mean, he gets great seats at the games too. So there's that.
That's great to hear. I mean, I was in a program that valued managers. A lot of our assistant coaches had, started as a manager and worked their way up. So that's definitely great to hear, especially in a big time, high major program like that. For sure.
Yes.
Well, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today. We got so much good stuff out of you. We're here in the summertime, but it seems like now with just transfer portal and everything that even with college basketball, it never ends. So I know you're going to stay busy. You got plenty to do in the meantime, but we wish you the very best of luck, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a blast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and good luck to you with everything with your career too.
Thank you. Another great episode of Somehow We Managed today. Dana O'Neill, what a special guest she was. So many years of experience in sports journalism and so many great stories. As always, we are very thankful of those of you who are listening. We continue to ask you to like and subscribe. We are on all social media outlets, and we are on Spotify now, so check us out on Spotify. And as always, a huge shout out to Mr. J.R. Quitman for producing our podcast. But as always, we're very appreciative of those of you who are listening, and tune in next week. We'll have more action for you at Somehow We Manage.